So today we have a great webinar coming. We have a very special guest and I think a very interesting topic as we are in the midst of reopening the economies, at least here in Europe. I know that in Latin America it's not the case, and in Asia in some cases we have a campus in Singapore and we know how tough the situation it is right now. But at least we, in many of our countries, we are starting to think about what's next and how we reopen while staying safe and being careful. But what kind of new normal or what kind of things will happen next? And I think we have the privilege to have Hans Stegeman here with us, and we will talk a little bit about what can be, or how can the financial sector and even governments play an active role on resetting the economy towards a more greener and inclusive system. Is that possible? Is that what's coming? And I think in the previous webinars, we talked about impact investment. We had an introduction to what ESG, environmental, social, and governance criteria mean in finance. Now we are going to take a little bit of a broader picture, of a macro view. And I think this session will be a key to understand what is at stake and to be able to think systemically, to understand what is the role and the place of the financial sector when we talk about the idea behind all these webinars, that it is precisely mobilizing private capital for impact. So we also will learn about the experiences and practice of Triodos Bank, and I think they have a very, or what call a lot my attention on the mission and vision that it says is where money has values and creating a society that protects and promotes quality of life. So this is it's actually a very provocative, I would say, mission for a bank, and we'll see how that comes alive. And I'm looking forward to our discussion today. So I wanted to start, as I always do, just with a little bit of a concept, and we have talked a lot about impact investing, but in a bigger umbrella, if you want, what does it mean and what is sustainable investment? So when we talked about sustainable investment, we're really talking at a menu of strategies that can be used in combination in order to make investing decisions, but especially including environmental, social, and governance criteria that we have been talking a while ago, and we had the framework. But some of those pool of strategies that you can have, and some are really actually not new. If you look at here, the idea of negative screening or exclusionary practices, we can trace it even to the 90s if you think about the apartheid, and when there was a call to boycott the governments of South Africa and to actually not put private capital or put capital in order to push for a change in the system. So this idea of negative and exclusionary screening has been at the heart, and I would say at the beginning, of sustainable investing. We also have norm-based investing, and especially for certain companies or certain sectors that can be in conflict or do not agree with, somehow my PowerPoint moved, to the trends principles of the global compact or certain controversial issues. Something that came out much more into attention, I would say, in the last 5-10 years is the positive screen and the best in class. So we're not only going to screen out companies, but we are going to invest in the best ones, in the ones that are doing well, in order to create a positive incentive. And in a very special side on this part, and we will have a speaker next week about that, sustainability theme investing. So if you are, and we talked a lot about impact investment and the role of intentionality. So if you really care about climate change or water or deforestation or child labor, I don't know. So you go and you invest in a fund that focuses really on clean water, renewable energy. Something that I've been doing a lot lately, and I've been working with asset managers and with for example, is about ESG integration in general in the portfolio. And something very interesting is we are trying to include this criteria in a way that is meaningful and is purposeful. It's not just a blank statement or just a blank formula, but that with the different banks, and even I'm talking to a bank and how they in Asia, how they align it with Islamic finance, for example. So how can you integrate ESG criteria, even align it with SDGs, align it with what your mission and vision is, and how can you be, again, intentional about it. And another side, and I think a very promising side, and we'll talk a lot, is about active ownership. So there, the financial sector actually gets involved and has a say and has a vote in order to push or to work with, let's say, companies in a transition or in a transformation. And today we're going to talk a lot about that transition and how the financial sector have a role, precisely being a part, a driver, a partner for corporate and even broader systemic transformation. So I think you're in for a real treat today. And in order, and to start, I want to see a little bit your opinion on, and we're going to do a little poll, here. So what do you think will happen after? Because we're going to talk today with Hans precisely about how is the corona crisis changing or pushing for a change in the economy. So I will open the poll. So it's quite interesting. We have, obviously you can choose more than one option, so the percentages are not very reflective, but I think the one that has the most votes is actually business practices and emphasis on the short-term profitability and growth to a more longer-term view. So that is the first, and the second one is actually your personal behavior. I think you have a little less trust on the government and even on a systemic view that we can get away and go more into prosperity measures, or including and getting rid of GDP, regardless of all the discussions we have seen in the past. I don't know if I share and very few of you, and it's actually 12 people, thought, okay, we're going to go back to normal and nothing is going to change. No, so in order to I think it gives us a very good view, and I think obviously there is a little bit of a bias sample here if you're coming to webinars like this, is because you feel that there will be a change or something is happening. But I think it is interesting to think how we drive that change and how we're really going to support companies from the financial sector perspective, from the government in this transition, so we hopefully can speed up the process, because we know it's costly. We know that probably a recession is coming and a difficult moment. So what is the role of private capital, in particular the private sector, to speed up this transformation? So without further ado, and I already talked too much, I want to introduce you to Hans Stegeman. He's the head of investment analysis and economics at Triodos Bank, and he's responsible for the macro strategy and has the analysis of socially responsible investment, SRI, I would say, sorry, and he joined Triodos Investment in 2017. Before, he had more than 20 years as an economist working on different fields of macroeconomics, long-term forecasting and scenario strategy, and circular business models. Before joining Triodos Bank, he was at Rabobank as a chief economist. And I find that another piece of interesting information, and I think this is why he has such a broader view and lens when he looks at things. He was at the Netherlands Bureau for Economic Policy Analysis and Labor Union, that I cannot pronounce very well, probably, at Bacabo. Hans studied economics at Maastricht University and worked on a PhD on circular economy. So he is really an expert on this field, and I'm very pleased to have him here with us. So welcome. Can you tell me a little bit more about Triodos Bank, about what you do, and how can you say that and why do you think Triodos Bank is at the forefront of sustainable investment? How can you introduce us at the things you do?
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the intro. A lot of questions you posed at the beginning. So maybe on Triodos. Triodos is founded almost 40 years ago with only one mission to change finance and finance change, to show that you can also have sustainable finance, that you can finance sustainable business. And in the 90s, we started with microfinance already. And almost 15 years ago, a little bit more than 50 years ago, we also started with investing in listed companies. So Triodos is a mid-sized, as we call it, European bank, founded in the Netherlands, but also active in Belgium, Spain, UK, Germany, and France. We are a co-founder of the Global Alliance on Banking on Values, because that makes, I think, Triodos a little bit different than other banks. So it's what we call values-based. So we're very explicit on what we want to achieve. And I work on the asset management side, so at Triodos Investment Management, where we have a long-standing record of impact investing, so microfinance, renewable energy, etc. And on the listed side, we call it also impact investing nowadays, because what we do is try to have impact first in our investment approach. If you compare it to the ones you showed before, yes, we started with exclusion, ESG integration, best in class, but we moved on to really put on impact first, like I think the impact themes you had on that slide, and also in our investment approach combined with active stewardship, we try to achieve as much impact as possible there. So that's maybe in a nutshell what we try to do.
That's excellent. So how are you gonna? I know you will organize the agenda if you want to share with us, and then we move.
Yeah, so the agenda for now, as you all know, it's a kind of hectic times, especially when you work in financial industry and as a strategist trying to get something out of what's happening. So what I did is a story we just wrote on starting with the economy, because Triodos has an opinion on the economy, and we don't think that everything will change, to come back to the questions, in some way naturally, but we think some things must change. So I will start a little bit with what we call the root causes of what should change. Then we come, maybe you can go on with clicking on it. And then we come very shortly to the Corona crisis, because everyone experienced it every day. And then I think the largest part will be about crisis management, and especially about change, what should change. And if you look at this figure, what the picture I have on the right side is what I think it's well, we have a lot of pictures and a lot of ideas. It's instead of aiming at GDP or only financial profits, what we try to do also in our investment approach is to have central in everything the planetary boundaries at the bottom. In the middle, the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we try to do within the limits of the Earth capacity, optimize the Sustainable Development Goals. And as a consequence, we have, of course, the risk-return profile of all our investments. So that's, I think, in very short, what we try to do here.
Good. So you say that you're going to start with the economy. So what's wrong with the economy, and probably things that were wrong even before the COVID crisis, no? So what would be the diagnosis of what's wrong with the economy?
Yeah, I think if you can put on the slide, although I don't know if you want to have the slides always always on. I think there are three big chunks of it. What we've seen now, especially, I think in every country, I call it a no buffer economy. The fact that there is almost no resilience in our economic system. If you talk about value chains, but also about households or the balance sheet of companies, it's very, very efficient. That's how we made our economy, but efficiency has also a drawback, and that's what we have seen right now. And that's, if something gets wrong anywhere, we have a problem in the whole economy. And that's also about high debt. As you might know, global debt is higher than ever, corporate debt, public debt. And what I always say, debt is no problem. I have nothing against debt. But if you have debt, you have to use it productively, because you have to repay it some time. And if you don't invest with it, or make money work for something real, how are you ever going to repay it? And if you see, on the other hand, low productivity, then you can already count that even before the corona crisis, we already had a problem. We knew it. And some economists think it's lack of demand, it's structural lack of demand, but it might also be overconsumption. And a lack of extra overconsumption might be the problem. So that's an economic problem, but also a sustainability problem. And what became especially clear is the lack of buffers. And what you can learn from that, if you look at state support, the public support at the moment here in the Netherlands, where I live, well, the government is quite able to stimulate the economy. But you see it in other countries where a few of you live, where governments can do less, where health systems are less equipped for handling a corona crisis. The economic effects are also getting bigger. And the last point on this is our growth addicted system. We don't have any way to solve a problem if the economy doesn't grow. And a growing economy, there was also a lot of news today about the carbon emissions that decreased to a large extent in the last few weeks. I must say, then the relation between economic growth and the environment is again clear. So decoupling between economic activity and environmental damage is still very hard to get to. So we have to discuss it some way. But that's the no buffer economy. And maybe very short on unequal society and vulnerable people. Then we had already an unequal economy. So inequality in advanced economies grew, especially wealth inequality, income inequality, and that was the recipe we used after the financial crisis of nearly 10 years ago, and it grew only harder. That's different in a lot of emerging countries where we saw it's getting a little bit better in terms of inequality by a recipe of growth. But in general, inequality was not solved. So that's still a challenge. And that became clearer, and that's also the other point on social inclusion, where we see a big challenge, especially during the corona crisis in emerging markets. How can people have food if they don't have any work, if they are not able to go to work? And the last point on inequality, which is a really market point, is about market power. What we see in financial markets, that the winners are the big tech companies with those very liquid balance sheets with a lot of capital on it, like the Googles, like the Apples, also profiting in terms of IT from this crisis. But that market power leads also to inequality to a large extent. And we see it amplified by this crisis.
You had at the bottom of your, or I would say not the bottom, but as a ground part, is living without the boundaries of the planet, no? And you also had at the third part there is a relationship with nature. So why this component? And you talked a little bit about the decoupling a minute ago, no? But why our relationship with nature is so important?
Yeah, there are the point I already made before about carbon emissions, and that's also about growth addiction, but also relation with nature. So our material consumption, our effects on climate change are really connected to our economic system. But our relation with nature and corona crisis is maybe also the last point, how we consume and how we see also nature. And that's maybe one slide I want to show a little bit further, so we skip a lot. because economic activity has large consequences for land use, so deforestation. But we saw also, I skipped the second one because it's getting a little bit technical, but intensified agriculture. So our food and agri system, the supply chains, food processing on a large scale, poor regulations, etc., make it very hard to, on the one hand, have respect biodiversity and our planetary boundaries, and on the other hand, feed all the people. And then somewhere we get stress. So I don't want to say, like the almost the last point in the slide, that those poorly regulated wildlife trade, of course, that's a symptom of the system, but a virus can only spread because of economic activity and because we fly so much and because we live so close together and close to nature because there's not so much space. So that's a part of the troubled relation with nature, which really, I think this is not a cause, but it's really underlying our problem. So I don't want to say that Corona is caused direct by this problem. So, but it's in the system. It's in the system we've created in total that this can happen. A pandemic can happen, and even the 5 biggest risks from the World Economic Forum, even before this crisis, so in January, were related to our relation with nature. So natural disasters, not a pandemic, it was not in there.
No, it's true.
but all the other, and that also belongs to this picture. Our relation with nature has become really different in the last, I think, 5 to 10 years. We see a lot of risks for our businesses coming from nature, and that's our relation with nature, because we don't know how to solve a climate crisis or to solve these kind of problems with our economic activity. So that's why sorry.
We have 2 questions, and I think are interesting. One from Pietro, another from Hang Chong, and they're both referring to the current context. And do you think the current economic situation, when a huge rise on unemployment and a deep recession, and corporates trying to survive, reducing the pain, do you think they will be able to fare and to go towards a more sustainable solutions? And again, we can frame it in a bigger picture. How do you think the Corona crisis will affect or is affecting the scenario that you see?
Yeah, that also depends on us as investors, but also as citizens. What do we expect from government? For instance, to give a very small example, what we see is that a lot of big companies ask for state support, for instance, in the US, but also in Netherlands, where they, before the Corona crisis, did a lot on share buybacks, for instance, had paid huge bonuses, and now they want to have state support to keep employment. And that's a moral question for us as investors. You can say, and then you have, of course, a big discussion also in the Netherlands. Is that morally, or is it just helping people in a crisis to have their jobs? And for me, it's in the end morally, because if you put public money, in this case, in a company, and you don't ask the question, what are you going to do in the long term with that money? Then it's too easy. And what you see, especially in the US, I must say, I don't think that shift to a public debate is happening. So and that's always my struggle. I want a lot of things to change because I think we have to, for our children, for future generation. But that's not to say that it will happen at the moment.
How has the coronavirus disrupted the economy? Because I know from a macro view, you have an interesting framework, obviously the circular flow, but you're showing how deep this is affected and how important will be precisely these flows of injections of money that you're just mentioning. Where do they go? No, so
maybe we can take that one up. So what you see here is what economists call the circular flow of money. So what you see here is how money flows between households, government, businesses, and the financial sector in this case, and also the rest of the world as the international part of it. And what happened first with the Corona crisis was that national supply chains in China got disrupted. So if you click one, then and also two, and then after that also international supply chains, because Chinese factories were part of international supply chains for mobile phones, for car components, etc., especially in the region of Wuhan. After that, after the supply shock, we also got a demand shock from disrupted supply chains, and also then demand fell away because some countries got in a lockdown. In phase 3, and that was more the acute phase, we saw social distancing and disclosures having a huge impact on consumer spending. 30% in a lot of countries, the total effect of those measures, depending on how long and how stringent they were. So maybe on the next one, let them come in, I will talk over it. So on 4, and what you can see already, and these are more the long-term effects, is postponed investment decisions because of confidence in cash flows and uncertainty. So these are getting more to the structural effects of a temporary crisis on the future growth potential of an economy. And that's happening. Layoffs, reduced working hours, we see it all over the world. That people have less work, so that means lower wages or no wages. That means less consumer spending, and then we have the circle going around and around. And then we have the next one, and that's also bankruptcies of businesses. That's not the first, but the second part of it, we also see it happening, and that depends, of course, on the length of lockdowns. If we get a second wave of infections, and how reopening of economies will go, how severe that effect will be. And what we see is that the effects are in general more severe for SMEs, for small and mid-sized companies in a lot of countries, in some sectors that are very much hit by lockdowns, like leisure, like logistics. Now logistics less, I must say, but so mostly the sectors which depend on a lot of activity from people, restaurants, etc. So then what we see, because of unemployment, household stress, financial stress, and then in the end, and we see it already happening in some countries, then it comes to the financial sector, that we see bankruptcies, that we see provisions for loans, etc. So you can also let the last one come in. Mm-hmm. And what if this goes on a little bit longer, because we saw in the first phase in a lot of countries, the financial sector wanting to help the real economy by postponing payments on loans, etc. But if it takes too long, we can get again disruption of financial channels if the provisions that banks have to take are too high. We can get to the problem, and then we can get as I call it, a reversed financial crisis. So starting in the real economy, going to the financial sector, and then feeding back into the real economy. That can happen, and all that especially monetary authorities have done over the last few weeks is preventing that will happen.
Good.
Sorry.
No, go. I think we have two questions related that might somehow relate to this. And one, if the way we grow is the problem, so how are we going to grow out of this, or what are we going to do? And on the other hand, is there a difference? Do you see a difference in countries that have more savings compared to countries that actually are in debt?
Yeah. Maybe the first question. I think in the end, because what we do now in a lot of countries, trying to save the current economy, so the economy as it was, with a lot of money for the future, so with a lot of debt. So that's what we do. But we come back to that a little bit later. I think you should make choices on that, and in the end, we also must have a very big discussion globally. if we ever going to repay all that debt. And that depends, of course, on countries, and that relates to the second question. Yes, of course, countries with a better starting position have more possibilities to get an economy through the crisis in general. But then it also differs how vulnerable the economies are. So more open economies are more vulnerable. Economies with a higher private debt are more vulnerable. So it's not only about public debt; it is also on private debt. So it's a more nuanced question, but in general, more prosperous countries have a better starting position, have in general better healthcare, etc., and makes it easier to weather this crisis.
So, what do you expect to happen in the following? I know you presented some scenarios.
Yeah, we don't have to discuss
next?
them.
Okay.
Yeah, no, maybe very shortly. Nobody knows. No, and because this crisis came so suddenly. You saw it also in financial markets. Normally, you would expect that equity markets are running before an economic crisis, or mostly half a year before it. So they caught up in March with very heavy downturns. But for the real economy, yes, a very hard stop. And we see now the real data coming in of half of March and April. And it's not looking good in no country. But we don't know at the moment, from an economic perspective, how long it will last. We don't know how long measures. So there's a little bit of easing of measures in a lot of countries, but how fast can we go? We don't know. That really determines the depth of this crisis. What is the consensus currently is that it will not go that quickly, that we are afraid of a second wave, and that the lack of synchronization might lead to extra trouble in the economy because of supply chains that are not in line with each other. So starting up the economy in a different speed way is a challenge. That's what we know. So all major forecasters expect that we will have permanent damage from this crisis. So a deep recession 2020, better in 2021, but not catching up all the growth we've lost in 2020. So that's the main.
We've seen governments stepping up drastically in many countries, and you put an outstanding number there. So, yeah, if you want to mention a little bit and talk about it, what is? I actually show my daughters this number when you send me a presentation. Said, can you say what number is this? 12 zeros, you know.
Yeah, it's 15 trillion. It's 15,000 billion dollars. Yeah. To the rescue in 10 weeks. And this is not all. So this is everything together. So the expansion of balance sheets of central banks, the fiscal measures of governments, so also guarantees everything. And I think it's already higher because it's from 2 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. So this is all I want to show with this number is that it is really, really a lot what we try to do. And I want to compare it with two other things. So on the Sustainable Development Goals, there's already, I think it's in 2014 paper of the UN that they said it takes 5 to 7 trillion annually to realize the Sustainable Development Goals in 2030. So that's still less than the 15 trillion, but it's annually, so it's more. And it's public and private money. All I want to say with this is that if we are capable of spending 15 trillion on saving an old economy and knowing that it is not enough and improving nothing, only saving, then 5 to 7 trillion is also possible. So that's the positive one. And I compare it to the one on the right. That's the subsidies on fossil fuels globally, 5.3 trillion annually. So the easy way to do it was to shift the one on the right to the left, and you're almost there. And you don't need that 15 trillion. But it's, of course, not so easy because you get all kind of redistribution effects. But we talked, that's why I want to mention it. These numbers are very big. And we always thought 5 to 7 trillion to realize the Sustainable Development Goals is impossible. But if we are able to spend 15 trillion in 10 weeks, why is that impossible?
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things, apart from being sometimes very cynical about the possibility of change for people. On the other hand, you cannot. You have to see that this is incredible what we are capable of as a human race if we have to.
Mm-hmm.
Spending a lot of money, but also making, as a person, radically different choices. We have to stay at home. We have to do radically different things, and we do it in general.
Mm-hmm.
And that gives hope, of course, that we also can change other things if we want to.
So talking about the other things and maybe these bigger choices that are also hard to make, that looked impossible, and I agree with you. We have hope of a greener reopening and that these tough choices will be made. What do we save if we have to go and we have to make these tough choices? What do we do? What do you think we should do?
And maybe on the positive side, we don't have to do that much. We see some sectors that are doing relatively well in this crisis. I think we should not be concerned about the future of healthcare companies, on pharma, on local food, on logistics, on renewable energy. I think in general they will be okay. But we can make choices that we save ourselves some money. It was never so cheap to let fossil fuel companies strand. Because of also the decline in oil prices, their valuation went down dramatically. So it was never so cheap to impose at this moment carbon taxes and let them go. Not on purpose, but just let go how the market works. And that might mean some bankruptcies of fossil fuel, air traffic. We know it, I think, in a lot of countries. Hospitality, like the Airbnbs, and maybe also part of manufacturing. So this is gearing up a sustainability. So we can go to the next slide. It was already there. So this is gearing up a sustainability transition. We know we have some choices to make. We have in the Paris Agreement, we have sustainable development goals. So we kind of know where we want to head as a world society. But then it helps if we have to step in as government, as public, as we, that we do it in the right direction. So, and what will help if we make all the help companies get conditional on sustainability guidelines? And in Europe,
some conditions very timidly, I think, and not given to companies that are some countries, I think Canada and Poland, like they're in fiscal paradises, but still not going in a bigger framework. No.
No, it's very country dependent, but I think in Europe, and that's on this slide, we have a lot of policies already in place or almost in place, where we can refer to if we give help to companies. But also, we can, in a lot of countries, it's possible to, if you help an airline, at least give them targets for carbon reduction, for carbon emission reduction. That's not so hard to do. So you can step in and give some conditionality on it to get a more sustainable economy. And also, and it's the second point, make also society in the end profit from the upside. So not only debt, but also equity, to have a voice and a stake, but also profit if it's going better. And I think we missed that opportunity. So I'm not preaching for a socialist economy, but at least a stake, especially on the listed side, would help also to gear up a sustainability transition and to make that a little bit better. And then together with that, yes, we need a lot more of private capital, because we spend so much now that we have to step in dramatically on the private side to gear that transition.
Good. So how do we build a resilient and inclusive recovery? How can we have a forward-looking crisis management, and what do you think we need to change? What is in this part of need to change in your framework that we could address? I will put the framework now so we see it.
Yeah. Wait for it. Yeah, we are now in the last part. Maybe also for time's sake, yes, this one. What we try to do. So this is also part of our own investment strategy, but I think it's also applicable to a lot of other transitions which we envision. So this is about how can you see transitions, and we're in general on the upper left hand side. So that's the old economy, fossil meat based, etc. So a lot of words that are really from our economy. So and this is also part of the listed world. So the biggest companies are here, and you see a lot of risks attached to these kinds of companies. So physical risks in terms of what we see, disasters, natural disasters, lack of biodiversity, droughts, etc., all related to these kinds of companies, and also transition risks. If we're going to change, what will that do with their business models? And what we try to do to have less of these risks in our portfolio is positive selection. So select companies who are already leaders, front runners in different aspects in the business model. On physical risk, we don't want companies on our portfolios that are really exposed to those risks. And of course, reputation risks. If public opinion doesn't like some things companies do, like we see nowadays also with Corona crisis, public opinion is looking really differently to a lot of companies. You don't want to have them invested in. So this is the negative side. But what we try to do, and what I think should happen, is from the bottom left side, we see there the grassroots movement, the startups, the little companies, the social enterprises coming in. And that's, of course, also the mission of Triodos, try to help them, try to finance them in emerging markets in Europe, and scale them up to the upper right-hand side. That must be the new, more sustainable economy, and institutionalize that one and stabilize that one. And let it phase out what is not sustainable. And we make very explicit choices that we exclude fossil fuels in total because we don't think there's a future, for instance. So this is, and that was also referring to the title of this presentation. It also, you need also courage to do that, because people say, well, you're gonna give up some return if you make those choices. In general, I have to be honest, it did not happen over the last 10 years. If you just our SRI portfolios compared to a benchmark, we don't steer on a benchmark, but we compare with a benchmark, it's not that different. It's also not outperforming in general, but it's also not underperforming.
One question from Licha here, since your PhD dissertation was also on circular economy. You're talking about things we should not finance. Are you putting any special focus on circular economy? Should governments, and Nicole also asking, or I think somebody, or Payman also asking, should that be included also in the government rescue packages to look at processes, not only goods and services, and being circular?
And maybe it's good to go then to the next slide, how I view a sustainable economy, a little bit further. So the one with the circles in it.
Good. Yes. Next one.
Yeah. Because that's a good point. Also from an investment perspective, but also from a government perspective, a sustainable economy is not only about products. So this is how we view in general a sustainable economy. It's not only about solar panels and electric cars and health. That's what you normally see in thematic funds. It's also about food and agri, so sustainable food and agri, renewable resources, of course, mobility, etc. But it's also about circular economy and social inclusion, which is more in this approach, more about processes. How do we treat materials? what is our responsible in the supply chain for materials, but also our responsibility in terms of products we make and guarantee schemes, etc., design of products. So that's on the circular economy part. And on the social inclusion part, it's also about how we treat people. But that's partly about board diversity, but also about labor treatment in a broader context, and also career management, etc. So that's really broad. And in a sustainable economy, it should all be in there in some way. And what we do there is make rather strict choices on different aspects. So we don't say Tesla is always good because it's electric cars. No, we excluded Tesla because the remuneration package of Elon Musk was quite high. And we didn't get any answers about how they treat materials in their cobalt supply chain. And we want to know, because that's also a part of being sustainable, as an example.
On that take, Valerie is precisely asking about that. She's asking, how long do you proceed with the due diligence before investing in a secure company? And what does it mean? So what due diligence do you do, and how much do you engage?
Yeah, this is on the listed part where I was talking about. So that's we are really bottom-up investors in concentrated portfolios in our listed side, but we take a lot of time. We use all the data sources, so ESG data, impact data, but then we have our own questions. And normally, before we invest in a listed company, we ask extra questions to that company to be really sure if it meets our what we call minimum criteria, so our exclusionary criteria, but also if the story on that positive fit we believe is really good. And then we talk always about transitions. So it doesn't have to be that everything is good, especially on large cap companies. It's very hard to find that everything is good, but we need to believe in the strategy and the transitional contribution of the strategy going forward. And if we believe in it, so it's also normative, but we are a value-based bank, so that makes it easy. But it's not, and that's the difference in our approach. We have a vision of the future. We want to have a sustainable economy. We believe there are transitions we have to finance. And we make case by case our own in our investment case, our opinion on that company. Is this good enough? And that's what we try to do in this complex system. We have to go a little bit further, I think, and maybe go to the role of finance in general, maybe. Yeah. Sorry, I'm talking too long.
No, this is very interesting. Sorry, I was trying precisely to move to that. Didn't realize I was already in there.
Yeah, you were.
Sorry. Good. So in this change, you're talking what is precisely the role of finance, and how you make this change happen.
I won't talk too long about redefine, revalue, redesign, but we say the transitions consist of a few elements. We have a paper on it. It's on our website on these elements. And we have a role of public policy, because as finance, you cannot do it alone, et cetera, et cetera. A role of businesses, things you have to send. But if we restrict ourselves to a role of finance, we have to be very clear on what you should do. You don't have to. You should not report only on risk and return. Of course, most of the clients is what's mostly on their head when they're going to talk with someone from finance or from investing. But it should also be on impact. You have to report as financial institution on the impact you have with your investments. And you also have to commit yourself. What do you want to achieve? It's very easy to say our carbon emissions of our portfolio are 5% lower than a benchmark, but what's your impact then? And what do you want to achieve with it? Must it be in line with the Paris Agreement or not? What do you want to have there? So that means better impact reporting. And what we see in Europe, regulatory incentives on impact and resilience help. So if we have good regulation, not only on the financial side, but also on the impact or the sustainability side, I think that really helps to redefine the mission of the financial sector and the contribution of the financial sector to sustainability. On revalue, this is also about the role of equity versus debt. I think what the crisis have shown, that debt financing also does have some risk, especially in a low interest rate environment, that it makes some companies very vulnerable. So equity will help there, but that also depends on the conditions to that equity financing. So we can also do a complete different webinar on that. But we should really discuss it, because it also, and that's government regulation, if you can still deduct your interest rates from your taxes as a company, you want to have more debt financing in general and be highly leveraged, because it's better for the short-term shareholders' interest. So that's a big discussion behind it. But also, as a financial sector, you have some own obligations on that. And then social equity, with that I mean also combinations of gift money and other philanthropy and other sources of money. And I think the last discussion, and this morning a discussion with the CEO of our bank, he said maybe we should not put that in. But as an economist, I still think we have that discussion on debt cancellation. And you can also call it in a better name and saying debt to SDGs. That you say instead of that you get healthcare or something, but it's essentially the same. And the last, debt jubilee for citizens. Yeah, if people cannot read, the point on debt is, if we have so much debt and we expect that people all gonna repay it, companies or citizens, that will weigh on growth for a long term. That will weigh on our well-being for the long term. So we have to find a solution. I really believe it, as an economist, not as a banker. That's a different role. But it's a discussion we have to have. And then in general, in redesign, I think a global sustainability finance agenda, and what we always stress, resilience in the system also depends on diversity in the financial sector. So not only big banks or only small banks, but different ownership forms of banks. So a really different financial sector, regulated in a good way, with resilience in their investments and also on their own balance sheets, but also in terms of diversity, that will help the financial sector to contribute to a recovery.
One quick question, we're running out of time, but this is very interesting, and then I let you some closing comments. But there is a couple of questions here. Pietro is asking, would you invest in companies like Beyond Meat? And I want to go not only Beyond Meat, but he's saying, if we go and all want to invest in these great companies, and the whole financial sector gets in line with the things you're talking about, would this create a bubble? Do we have enough, or will create a bubble? And from Group F, Thaner is saying, how do you include in your investment advice, for example, OECD, RBC conditions that are for OECD countries, not everybody? So how can you push forward but avoid a bubble?
Yeah, and that's a very good question. And you see it already a little bit happening. Like Tesla, for instance. There is a chance of having a bubble somewhere. But in terms of transitions, I think that's unavoidable. Transitions are never a straight line. And if we attract more capital to more sustainable companies, their business becomes cheaper, so it's easier to scale. So that will accelerate the transition. From an investment perspective, if you really, from the bottom up investment perspective, you have to be careful. You have to be careful, of course. What we try to do, compared to you have, of course, a lot of sustainability indexes, not to take the obvious ones. So it's also from our perspective, stock picking. That's really to create return for our clients. Yes, and I think we should do that. And what we try to do is, going back to the transition curve, that X curve, try to find the companies that are a little bit on the lower left.
Yeah, going up.
Yeah, going up. Yeah, and that's what we try to create. This is really about the listed side. On the non-listed side, where we also have a few funds, it's very different. And also a question I see coming in: what's the average project size?
Yeah.
That's very hard to say. That depends on the type of project and because we have financial inclusion, we have renewable energy, and we have a few funds. Our total, so we are not a very large asset manager, 5 billion in different funds. So our lowest, I think the range finance, yeah, it's from 1 million or maybe sometimes less for financial inclusion to like 10 million or more. That's no problem. But it's very hard to give a general opinion on it.
So it's almost 12, it is 12 actually. So thank you very much. And I want to leave with this provocative reset button that you had in the presentation. And also maybe I think remind from my side the circular flow. And I wanted to look at what the role of the financial sector here is really the intermediary of all these transactions. So it really has a key role if we want to mobilize private capital into impactful solutions. And if we think about the risk side, we need to be covered. But if every crisis has that side, our defensive side, but also it needs to have an offensive. I'm a football fan, I'm from Argentina. So you need good people pushing and scoring and making the change happen. So I think I want to thank you very much, Hans, for this great talk. Lots of other questions, and so feel free to contact us or contact me. And if you want on LinkedIn or I think you have my contact information. And I hope we can invite you, because I think there are a lot of other things we can keep talking for the next one. And thanks so much for.
You're welcome.
There were so many questions. I try to keep the flow, but next time we'll go over some more. We'll do kind of an open heart conversation. So
it was a little bit too much, maybe.
Yeah. A very inspiring webinar, and thank you so much for your participation and I think very inspiring role for the financial sector. So thanks everybody. I hope I see you next week. That we'll go to talk about thematic investing with somebody from PicTech. So thank you very much and see you next week. Stay safe and take care. Good. Goodbye.